Yo, what's going on everybody? Today's video is actually going to be a little bit different. We're going to focus less on actual coding. And for the people out here who are mainly watching my channel for Next.js, we're going to focus on some Next.js architecture and kind of the trade-offs between doing stuff on the client and the server. And it's also kind of, for me, a commitment to try to do something new and better as a developer myself, because I've noticed that maybe in the 2.5 years I've been working professionally now, one of the things I definitely have to get better at is to resist the urge to start coding right away. A lot of times I get a ticket or something that needs to be done in my project, and I just hop right in, start coding, trying to solve the problem, and that's definitely been costing me more time than it should. So what I want to commit to is actually drawing out a plan and really first thinking about the trade-offs, the options. What can I actually take advantage of Next.js to make my life easier? And then once I have more or less everything planned out, I can only then start coding. So that's kind of like the commitment I want to start making by also just making this YouTube video. And to kind of demonstrate, like, I'm going to go over this new feature / component I'm building in Next.js. And it's a cool component because it covers some like CS degree stuff. So it covers recursion and like tree data structures, like stack and heap overflows even. And that's stuff you normally like never see in a web development project. So it's cool. It's the first time I'm actually doing some of that stuff. It covers like lazy loading. So you can kind of see the beginning. It's basically a file system viewer. And when you click on the folders, they expand. And I'm going to explain all of that in a second, but it's going to go over lazy loading and basically only fetching data when you actually need it. Client versus server trade-off. So this is very important. It's kind of the fundamental thing about web development, I feel like, and especially if you use Next.js, where that boundary is pretty well defined. We're going to also talk about query parameters and this pattern, or one of the few design patterns you have in React, where you can store state in like the parent, and the parent controls like the children, and that's how you can share state between child components. So in this case, like this you can see as one component, and this you can see as another component. And when I click on one of these folders, this component here has to update the data about that folder. So you can see that there's like shared state between these two components. So now you need a parent component that's going to kind of share the state between them. And just the idea of fetching data on the client. Like one of the things that I still find difficult in Next.js is fetching data on the client. It's very easy on the server. But on the client, yeah, you're going to see how that becomes basically a bit of a different story. But so what is the component actually? Let's maybe make this a bit bigger so we can see a bit easier. The component basically has two parts. We have this directory viewer or folder viewer on the left side, and that is created from a database. So there's a database with, let's say, 500,000 assets, we call them. And the assets can be either folders or files, basically the same as on your computer. And we make a fetch to the database, making sure we're only getting the folders. And then we can kind of build this structure on the left because every asset in the database also has a parent ID. So basically like this folder stores a parent ID to this one and so on. So the database is kind of like a tree structure, if you'll see it. And the right side is supposed to show data about that folder. So if you click on this folder, for example, then right now I haven't fully finished the feature, but you're basically going to have the folder name, how many subdirectories there are, what is the folder size, so all of these things. So it's quite database query intensive, meaning once I click on one of these folders, a lot of things are happening. We're fetching a lot of things from the database. Those are getting pulled into the application. The application then also does code to format or to run an algorithm or to run a recursive algorithm, for example, to then get the data. So that's kind of what we have to understand before diving into the Next.js pattern. So now we know that somewhere we have to fetch directories from the database. Somewhere we have to create this structure where things are going to be subdirectories of other directories so that we can actually loop through that and start printing it out visually for the user to see. Then we also know that we need to connect this component on the right with this component on the left. So if we go to Eraser, we can kind of see what are our options. So the first thing I thought of was we can have a server component. And here in the server component, let's say we're going to fetch data from the database, or fetch, let's say, all the folders. So again, this was like naive approach when I first started. Let's just fetch all the folders from the database. Now again, there's 500,000 assets in this database. Now, not all of them are folders, most of them are files, but even if there's 1,000 or 2,000 folders, this can get quite intense to fetch all that data. But anyways, this is my first approach. Fetch all the folders. Then in the application code, run a recursive algorithm with parent ID. So what this is basically doing is it's using recursion to go over the tree and make a array of objects that's going to basically tell the client-side code how to print those directories. So that's where we are right now, right? Fetch all the folders, application code, we run an algorithm. And it's going to also be a recursive algorithm. Then this server component, I can now have, here's going to be the sidebar. And then on the other side, I can have the folder info component. So yeah, I guess that's pretty easy. This is the sidebar. This is the folder info component. But this sidebar, it needs to be a client component. And we know that because, well, it needs interactivity. When I click, it needs to be able to react to that and update some state. So the idea was, my first idea was that this server component would then, no, I don't want an arrow there, would have here client, and I would want to keep this folder info a server component. And the reason why I would want that to be a server component is because, remember, whenever I click on one of these folders, this has to update and do a bunch of queries on the database. So it's useful to be on the server because then I have access to the database. If I'm on the client, then I need to make a client-side request. It's slower. Also, the algorithms I'm going to use to, for example, calculate stuff like the folders and the folder size, those all have to run now on the application. So they all have to run on the user's computer instead of on a powerful server that's more scalable with maybe like Docker or Kubernetes in the future. So that's kind of what I was thinking. Okay, it would be nice to keep this on the server because that's where I have more compute. And this, I have no choice. So it's on the sidebar. But now the question is, how can I communicate the state between these two? Because whenever a user clicks a folder on the sidebar, the folder info now needs to update. And it needs to show data about a new folder. And here you only really have one choice, or two choices, I guess. You can use query parameters. So in Next.js, let's say I go here and I could add, it's hard for you guys to see probably, but I can add a question mark. I guess you guys know what query parameters look like, but I could say, for example, core or asset ID is equal to whatever, 4. And then if I put that in the URL, I can then on the server component just parse that and I know which asset ID I'm working with. So whenever a user clicks on the sidebar, we're going to then change the URL, literally what it is, like www.whatever, and then question mark at the end. So that's one option. I can just change the asset ID. And then in the server component, I can parse that URL. And then with that, I can make my database calls, like relative to the ID. Then the other option is to just put it in the URL in a different way, which is, for example, like path, and then here, number 4, and then info, whatever it is. And then whenever in the sidebar you click on a new one, you just change this number like this. Basically, they have the same trade-offs. I prefer to just use this because maybe in the future, then I can also just put more query parameters like, filters or whatever. So I thought, okay, let's go with the query parameter route. Let's have a server component on the client. Whenever someone clicks on the directory in the sidebar, we're then going to change the query parameter, and the server component will then basically just parse this number, and it will use that to make database calls with the ID. And the other option is, it's just good to consider the other option before you dive into something. And the other option is, let's say, again, we start on the server. Here we do the same thing. We fetch all the folders. We run a recursive algorithm with the parent ID. But now we just have here client component. Let's call it a client parent. And this is going to be basically our state manager. So I would see this component as more of like a container. It just has a bunch of state variables that then the sidebar, it's going to render the sidebar and also no, not that, it's Command D. So this client parent is then going to render the sidebar and the folder info as client components, and it's going to manage the state. So what you can do, which I guess most of you probably already know if you've been using Next.js for a while, you can just pass functions as props to these components so that whenever someone clicks on one of the folders, you can update state in the parent, and then that state you can pass to the folder info, and that's how you share state between them. So now that we have these two different options available, let's look at the pros and cons of each. So in this one, the pros are, the biggest one is folder info. Okay, let me make this a bit bigger. Folder info renders on server. So why is that such a big pro? The main reason is that this folder info component needs to fetch a lot from the database. So it needs to query the database for different information. So for example, some of that data might be the folder name and the source, and so the URI source. And those are really cheap. That's really cheap data because it's just columns in the database and you can just fetch it. But stuff like direct folders and files, those are kind of expensive calculations because remember, SQL is not meant to store tree data structures. So it needs to then find all the folders with parent ID equal to blah, blah, blah. It needs to find it needs to sum up all the size of the files that have parent ID, blah, blah, blah. So you can see that this folder info component needs to have a lot of queries to the database and also potentially expensive ones. And if that is on the server, we get the benefit of a very strong computer. So the server, hopefully we've rented out a computer that's strong, has a lot of compute, and can also be scaled better. So we can set up different instances of the computer, and as more users start to interact with the app, we just scale horizontally, for example. So that is the biggest benefit of that, because otherwise we're at the mercy of the user's computer. Maybe they have a very slow computer and we're on the client. And so those calculations are going to be slower. So that's the main pro. The main con is page refresh. So the reason why this refreshes the page is because in this client component here, we're going to basically update the URL. And when the URL updates, it's a page refresh. Simple as that. So it won't feel instantaneous. It won't feel much like an app. It will be a bit slower and a bit more like clunky feeling, but it will be much faster to actually display the data. So what about this? We have pros. The main pro about this is it's simple, right? We have now abstracted, we're not worried about this client and server model as much. We just know, okay, here we fetch the data, pass it to the client will manage all the state. So it's a simple approach, but con, mercy of the user's computer. And actually a second con is fetching data on the client. So I hate fetching data on the client in Next.js. I haven't found a good way to do it. And the main reason is now we need like some kind of dependency. So if you think about it, this needs now a, let's say database. And then this is now like a dependency. And the dependency is basically what the user clicked on. So whenever now the user clicks on something, we need to update that state in the parent so that the state can go into the folder info. And then we can now make a fetch using, like I use the SWR library, which creates a dependency between a component and external data. So like in this case, it's kind of okay. I need to now fetch data on the client, and luckily SWR libraries like that can handle caching for you and more complicated stuff about fetching data on the client. But in general, I try to avoid it. So those are the main two cons. We have to fetch data on the user's computer, and we also need to do it on the client instead of on the server, where it's designed to be close to the data. So those are the pros and the cons of this system. But what I realized is that this whole approach right here is not really possible. And the main reason that is because of this part here, which was, I think I changed it, but this was fetch all the folders first. And the reason why that's not possible is kind of as predicted. If you have 500,000 entries in your database and you fetch, let's say 2,000-3,000 of those being directories, and you run a recursive algorithm on them, then what you're going to have is a very slow start. So what I need to do is lazy load. So if I refresh this page, you'll see that the only thing I've now actually fetched is the root folders. So this becomes fetch the root folders. And when I click on this, only then you see that short loading animation, only then do you actually fetch the next directories. But now we can no longer use this model, or at least not as easy, because now this sidebar needs state that updates basically, because in the previous model, the server would just find all the data and then pass it to the sidebar, and then that would be like the final state. So you wouldn't update these folders. But now, as I'm clicking on things, I need to fetch new data, and I need to update that to the state variable. And in this approach, you can't refresh the page, because if you refresh the page, that client-side data is lost. So this option no longer became possible because of lazy loading. That's basically how it works. Lazy loading prevented me from refreshing the page because I needed to store data on the client, and storing data on the client does not survive page refreshes. The only way that you can store data on the client, or kind of on the client and on the server, and survive page refreshes is through query parameters. But you can't put, or you shouldn't put, entire JSON objects into the query parameters. Of course, you could do it. You could do like JSON.stringify, and you put the entire tree object in here, and then in the server component, you kind of parse the JSON. That is always an option, but it just didn't feel like the right choice to go. So then I decided, okay, this is not really an option anymore. And can you see how much time now I've already saved? Just because of this first breaking down the architecture and the possibilities, right? I also now have a full kind of holistic view on whatever the advantages. Like I now have lazy loading down here. I have a simpler architecture. Now, okay, I have to deal with these two cons, but this one is more of a con for me since it's more work as a developer. And this is actually a con. That is kind of what I'm advocating, know your frameworks and how you can take advantage of them, know your possibilities. And now once that's out the way, we can focus on this model. So yeah, what you would see is the server component that actually only fetches the root folders. It doesn't even run an algorithm per se, it just makes an object from the root folders. And again, this is super fast. And it passes that data to this client parent component. And instead of it passing it as like, as the tree, it passes it as like an init tree, I like to call it. And the reason why it's an init tree, it's because it's like the initial tree that will be rendered. So if I refresh, this is then init tree. And whenever sidebar gets clicked on, it updates the client parent state and makes this basically like a new tree. And that's the state that's being stored here. And so anything other, now we have like this lazy loading, which is nice. It saves time. This part happens on the client, but luckily it's only one folder at a time. So you can kind of see how long that takes. It's pretty fast on my computer, but I have a good computer. If I do a bit of a bigger directory, You can see it already takes like 2 seconds, let's say. So if you have less good of a computer and multiple people using the system, it could slow down a lot. But yeah, that's kind of what today's video was about. Understanding your frameworks, creating a plan before you actually get down to coding, and then executing the plan based on what makes sense. So I hope you guys enjoyed this one, and stay tuned for some more Next.js content in the future.